Hello YouTube. Tamriel and the Elder Scrolls universe as a whole is full of interesting factions, from ancient knightly orders with extensive lore to something as mundane as a rat catcher's guild. And over the years I've covered many of these factions on the channel and have explored their backstories and their lore. Now today I've compiled all that lore into this one big long form lore video for you to enjoy with timestamps in case you want to skip a certain faction or skip this intro for example. Now, just a quick little disclaimer before we begin, this video is not some ranking of interesting factions, nor does it cover all the factions in the Elder Scrolls universe. It's just my pick of some interesting factions, chosen either because they have an interesting story, they have a less well-known backstory, while people know the faction, just not the backstory, or just because somewhere over the years I found them interesting or funny. So it's not a definitive list, and who knows, perhaps in a few years I'll make volume 2. That said, let us begin with what is in my opinion one of Tamriel's most interesting factions, the Ashaba, whom over the years I've been calling Tamriel's Witchers, because they have some striking similarities in their lore to the Witchers from the Witcher universe, as they fight monsters or well undead to protect the people of Hammerfell, yet nobody really seems to like them despite needing their protection, just like the Witchers. So let's talk about them after the intro. So, as mentioned in the intro, the Ashaba are a tribe of red guards dedicated to the purging of the powerful undead which do harm to the population of Hammerfell. As a tribe, they are nomadic and they rarely come into contact with the rest of Hammerfell's population, as they are shunned from the cities and are seen as cursed, despite serving a very useful purpose to the population. You see, red guards have an immense respect for the dead and even the undead. This is the reason why the Red Guards mummify all their dead, and Red Guard tombs are among the most elaborate and most decorated of all types of graves and tombs throughout Tamriel. Building large necropolises for the dead to honor them is not a rarity, and filling them with traps so that no outsider can enter them and disturb the dead in their eternal rest is also pretty common. The one exception to this rule are criminals whose bodies get specifically dumped in places far into the desert where their souls cannot find rest and where they may eventually become easy targets to rise from the ground as undead at some point if a necromancer comes into contact with one of these places. But the Red Guards venerate the dead to such a degree that even if an undead is raised and is running amok, it's absolute blasphemy to get rid of them, as the Red Guards believe that even disturbing an undead, so fighting it or hurting it, will make the person fighting the undead cursed in the same way they would be cursed if they disturbed a dead body in a tomb. But what if there's a really dangerous undead, for example a lich running amok, or if a necromancer threatens an entire community with hordes of undead? Well, first the Red Guards will try to deal with them in a way which does not hurt the undead, for example try to seal the lich magically in a temple, or somehow lock undead hordes away in a cave. But what if that doesn't work? Well, for that the Red Guards call upon the Ashaba, which means the unclean people or the cursed people. They are shunned by society, exiled and hated, and yet they are the one group who fights the dangerous undead. Like I said in my funerals video, they kind of remind me of the Witchers of the Witcher universe, who are also disliked by society and are basically the only ones capable of dealing with powerful monsters when they come along, and the population will call on them if that happens, but other than that they won't really want to have any contact with Witchers. So in that way they are basically the Witchers of the Elder Scrolls universe, but I digress. The interesting thing is that they do have contact with some in society and are contacted by society often when there is an undead problem to be dealt with, just like the Witchers when there's a monster problem to be dealt with. They're even known to give friendship coins to outsiders whom they maintain good relations with or owe a debt to. Now, in their fighting against the undead, they still practice great care while slaying them. For example, they have a very specific way with dealing with the undead. They always try to defeat them with as little strikes of their weapons as possible, to keep the body as intact as possible, since they view the body as a sacred chalice which simply needs to be ridden of the corruption inside if it's undead. Therefore, one of the ways they tend to slay the undead is by cleanly beheading it, as that only takes one single strike, and then afterwards the severed head is placed respectfully close to the body for interment. But even the single strike for a beheading comes with a rigorous ceremony for them, as the exact moment of severing, they need to utter a sacred Ashaba plea for forgiveness, and then directly after the severing they have to utter the Ashaba humble apology plea. All of that is likely to keep their own souls as clean as possible, although we don't really get a clear explanation for that. And actually, once they purge the tomb of undead, they also have elaborate rituals and spells of purification to prevent undead from rising again or angry spirits to rise at that place, something which is blasphemous for any Redguard to do, but it's tolerated if performed by the Ashaba. Now, the origins of the Ashaba lay in the First Era, during the great migrations of the Redguards, then still the Yokudans, from Yokuda, the ancestral homeland of the Redguards, to Tamriel. At the time, Yokuda faced great disasters, so as the Redguards migrated to Tamriel, waves of warriors came from Yokuda and landed on Hammerfell's coast to clean the place of elves and others so that they would have a place to live. One of these Yokudan migration armies, under King Zakwan of the Yokudan kingdom of Yat, fought against a sect of elves on the coast of Hammerfell called the Corellania tribe. In order to clear these elves out of Hammerfell, the warriors from Yokuda fought fierce battles against them, and once the war against these elves seemed to near its conclusion, King Zakwan sent his sons, Prince Samir and Hakmir, to kill the kin lady leading these elves, to sort of sever the head from the snake. But the elves were not ready to just give up, and while the princes were away, they infiltrated the palace of King Zakwan and killed him, and then reanimated his corpse to use against the Redguards, as the laws that they had brought with them from Yokuda already mandated that the undead could not be harmed. You can actually experience this as a flashback in the Elder Scrolls Online, where you play as one of the princes and discuss what they would do with their reanimated father. Their laws decree that his undead body may not be touched, else there would be exile, and none of them could actually succeed their father as the new king, as they both should be exiled if they touched their father's body. But at the same time, they could not leave him as an undead. They then make the difficult decision that one of the brothers would not harm their father and stay away and then succeed him as king, while the other would go and put their father's undead risen body down and accept exile. You as the player can choose which of the princes becomes king and which goes and takes down the undead, resulting in his exile. Actually, you play as the older brother, so the younger brother is ready to, accept exile since you were in line for the kingship, but you can choose to do it yourself and let him be king. In the end, it doesn't really matter who you choose, as one prince gets exiled for putting down their father's undead body, and he would be shunned by society, while the other would take their father's place as king. The exiled prince would leave their colony and start his own tribe of exiles in the desert, where he would live as nomads with his tribe and with his new family, which he also formed in the desert, and they would be nicknamed the Unclean Ones, or Ashaba, by the population of Hammerfell. Years after his exile, however, the exiled prince returned to civilization once more, because his brother, who had a long and successful reign by that point, was now threatened by a band of necromancers who attacked his colony kingdom. The exiled prince then came back with his people, who were already cursed, and they were able to take on the necromancers' horde, so they came to the rescue of those who shunned them and saved them from the undead. They then accepted the role of fighting the undead and protecting the people when they are threatened by the undead, to thereafter return to wandering the desert once more, to wait until they are needed to save the people again, and they took on the motto, "True honor need not be named," because their honor will not be named by society. So, while they are shunned from society, the people of Hammerfell do accept them, and they also seem to see them as necessary. And as such, while they are still outcasts, they are a bit normalized by the Second Era, as in the Second Era the Ashaba tribe even pays taxes due to the kingdoms where they hold long-time encampments, and their presence is generally just tolerated. During the Second Era in the Elder Scrolls Online, you can even join them and help them with an undead problem after they were attacked by some necromancers in the Alakir Desert. To be honest, that was a pretty neat quest, at least for vanilla ESO zone standards, at least. So yeah, I recommend giving it a try if you want to know, what it's like to be in Ashaba. Concerning the other eras though, we don't really know anything about how the Ashaba are doing in the 3rd or the 4th era, and by that I mean we literally know nothing about it. But I would like to think that they probably still exist in some way, and if the Elder Scrolls 6 is indeed set in Hammerfell, I would honestly not be surprised if we get a questline where we get to join the Ashaba and fight some sort of necromancer. Maybe Manamarco finds a way to return yet again and we have to fight him again. I mean, who knows, the possibilities are literally endless. Just know that if we get an Ashaba questline in the Elder Scrolls 6, or, maybe you as the main character, you literally start in your own version of Helgen, where the undead attack, you harm them, save the village, and are then just imprisoned, in customary Elder Scrolls fashion, only to then be exiled and forced into the Ashaba or something like that. Well, remember that your buddy Zork told you about this idea for the first time. And that's about all I can say about the Ashaba. Really one of my favorite factions in the Elder Scrolls lore personally, although some people don't really seem to like their lore. I always thought they were pretty cool at least. Let me know in the comments what you think of them. That being said, let's now talk about the next faction, specifically the Khajiiti caravans that we find wandering around Skyrim and the rest of Tamriel, where they're known as the Baandari caravans, and some of their deeper lore which most of the fans of the series are unaware of.
So, the Baandari. The Baandari peddlers are nomadic Khajiit who travel all over Tamriel, peddling their wares as long as you have the coin. And that's about all that most people know about them, that they're traveling merchants that often don't have the best reputation to the people of Tamriel. But their society is so much deeper than that, as the Baandari are a real subculture of the Khajiit. They have their own music, dances, folklore, food culture, drink culture, technology and laws, and are somewhat shunned even among Khajiit who do not truly trust them either, meaning that even in many cities and elsewhere they are forced to stay out of the gates. Now, their society itself, just like their culture, is quite separate from the regular society of elsewhere. They don't really seem to care about politics or kings or queens, and mostly do their own thing, operating by their own laws, as they see themselves as separate from regular Khajiiti society as well. You see, they see themselves as the children or wandering litter of the Khajiiti trickster and bandit god Baandar, a god that originally was scrapped from the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall but was later brought back in lore. They see themselves as wandering children of his, and they almost never settle down, almost always being on the road. Their society is split into several Baandari clans, who all seem to have their own territory that they travel in, usually a province or part of a province. Now, within that region, the clan often splits up into smaller caravans, which travel to different cities, and the different caravans then often meet up every once in a while to trade among one another. This system is actually most visible with the Khajiiti caravans in Skyrim. Now, while we don't know if they are actually Baandari, they operate in exactly the same way, and the Baandari lore of later games was based on them. So for this video, I will assume that they are Baandari. Because with them you can clearly see their internal hierarchy, as you have a clan leader, in the case of Skyrim's clan in the 4th era, that's Resad, who led all of the Khajiiti caravans to Skyrim, and once they split up into different caravans, each with their own caravan leader, but in the end they all still answer to the clan leader, who decides when they pack up again and where they move next. Now, within these clans, everyone part of the clan is seen as family, and within a clan, the Baandari treat each other as such, even if they are not related by blood, as life on the road is hard, and with the distrust of other races on them, they have to look out for one another, because no one else will do it for them. Like I said before, this kinda led to a whole Khajiiti subculture with their own traditional food recipes, their own traditional drinks, their own music, dancing styles, and their own traditions. In addition to that, most Baandari are said to be more resourceful than your average traveler, being better equipped to deal with hardship, as from a young age every kitten learns survival skills. In addition to that, the Baandari also have their own technology, as they develop their own magical moon compasses to help them find their way across Tamriel to new distant lands. And they even salvage other cultures' technologies and adapt them for themselves, as at least one clan, likely while traveling Skyrim or Hammerfell, was known to repurpose and reprogram old dwarven spiders to fetch them things from hard to reach places, which is pretty impressive. An average clan in the lore is very diverse, as all members of the clan tend to travel. And in the lore, in Khajiiti caravans, you tend to find all types of Khajiit, even the large ones that look like tigers and lions, such as the Sensharat Khajiit, that you generally don't see that much outside of elsewhere. You will also find many kittens or young Khajiit among the caravans in the lore, as kittens are often born on the road, as their families are ever wandering across the land. Now, other than kittens being born on the road, another way to grow the clan size is to pick up new members among the Khajiit, as clans tend to welcome almost everyone as long as they adhere themselves to the laws of the Baandari, also called the Baandari Code, which I'll talk about in a bit. Now, the caravans tend to consist of several wagons loaded with wares and tents, and sometimes you'll even find simple mobile homes among them. Generally, all of that is pulled by horses, as pulling wagons and carts is considered to be beneath the large Khajiit's dignity. However, the really large Khajiits do tend to carry caravan members on their backs while they travel. It's just the carts that they find to be beneath their dignity, which I kinda understand, as they're not a packing animal. Now, while the clans always insist on traveling around, they have been known to sometimes temporarily settle down. For example, during the Three Banners War, Cyrodiil was engulfed in an all-destroying war, meaning that it was far too dangerous to travel the land in Cyrodiil. So one of the clan leaders decided that his clan would set up a trading post in an abandoned imperial village and just stay there until the situation died down and the land became safer to travel again. In those rare cases, they then do settle down for a short while and live in borrowed abandoned buildings before hitting the road again. Now, between the different Baandari clans, there's often cooperation in separation. While different clans do trade with one another and respect one another, they rarely travel together and rarely stay together for very long. Two clans will often trade supplies and sometimes perhaps even people, to expand the gene pool a bit, I assume, but that's speculation. But in the end, the clans always part ways again. Something interesting in the relation between different clans is that there's an artifact, a small polished piece of moonstone, called the Eye of Baandar, named after their patron god. That artifact plays, or at least used to play, a pretty big role in their society. You see, the Eye of Baandar was an artifact made for trading. There was only one of them, and it may only be traded between Baandari clans. The clan that held the artifact could trade it to another clan, and the other clan then had to trade it against everything that the other clan desired. So for example, my clan has the eye, gives it to your clan, and then tells you that you have to support my clan in a conflict, or have to give my clan enough supplies to last the winter. But then you get the eye, and your clan is then allowed to use it on any other Baandari clan, and have them trade with you whatever you desire. I thought it was pretty interesting. Now, the final and perhaps most interesting thing about the Baandari that I want to talk about is the so-called Code of Baandari, a set of rules and laws that every Baandari clan member has to adhere to. If one breaks the code, one will become an exile among exiles, as society will already shun the Baandari, but upon breaking the Baandari code, one becomes a so-called cast cat, and one will also be shunned by the Baandari, as the code, for all terms and purposes, is sacred to the Baandari and is the basis of their way of life. You see, the code has several written and crucially also unwritten rules, and it's because of this code that the Baandari want other people to trust them, saying that as long as you expect the Baandari to always keep themselves to the code, you can trust them blindly. But that's perhaps going a bit far, as you'll see. Because the first rule in the Code of Baandari is that loose objects, so objects that are uncontained, being neither in someone's pocket, someone's drawer, or in someone's hand, so let's say a sword randomly laying somewhere on the street, should be considered abandoned and may thus be lawfully salvaged, as nobody apparently cares enough about them to be properly contained. And thus the Baandari are allowed to pick up and use or trade such objects. This is one of the reasons for the Baandari's reputation as thieves, as they may take this rule very literally, meaning that if they see you drop your wallet perchance and you then walk away without noticing, they are under no obligation to give the wallet back if they happen to pick the wallet up, as that wallet is considered abandoned and thus may be salvaged by the Baandari. This also makes it very easy to sell stolen goods, to some of them at least, as by saying that you found it unattended may be enough to at least some Baandari to accept your goods for trade. Of course, not all of them are like that, some of them are very honest, but it's part of why they have that reputation, because the code can be interpreted as such. Now, the second important law in the Code of Baandari is to always sell high quality goods, so no shoddy wares, as if you sell bad goods, the reputation of all clans is hurt. If one clan sells bad or low quality goods, it may leave a bad taste in the mouth of the consumer, and thus they will no longer buy from the Baandari, which is not a good thing for the clans as a whole. A third and pretty hilarious law is that if the people of Tamriel ask you for a fortune telling or for advice, something which often seems to happen as people find the Khajiiti to be mysterious, especially in provinces far away from elsewhere, then you have to give them a positive or pleasing piece of advice, as you may not offend clients. So one is advised to always keep your ears and eyes open so that you pick up on what's going on in an area around where you are, so that your nice words may actually also be good advice. I thought that was pretty hilarious. Now, other than that, we know that other rules include not to slander other Baandari clans or clansmen, you must always repay a gift in kind, and your deals don't always have to be fair, as long as they have the correct monetary value. So for example, if it's someone's last sword to defend themselves with, the Baandari may only give them the actual price in gold and not something extra to them defend themselves with, as that would exceed the monetary value of the trade. Even if the power imbalance of the trade is perhaps unfair, the monetary value is good, meaning that the Baandari has to trade it like that. But those are just the rules of the code that we know, the written rules. And the code of Baandari crucially also consists of unwritten rules, which may even override the written rules. And the Baandari aren't exactly inclined to share what those unwritten rules are exactly. So in the end, you still don't really know what you're up against when dealing with a Baandari merchant. So I kinda start to understand why the people of Tamriel may not be super inclined to trust them still. But still, if you keep to the code, the Baandari will mostly treat you fairly, and they are known to even pick up non-Khajiit members to their caravans sometimes, as long as they keep themselves to the code, which is pretty cool.
Alright, and that's about all I can say about the Baandari. Now let's talk about another faction, this one shrouded in a bit more mystery, specifically the Moth Priests of Cyrodiil, the mysterious future divining priests and monks who try to divine the future by reading the Elder Scrolls themselves. They call themselves the Cult of the Ancestor Moth, and they are significantly more mysterious than you might think. So let's talk about them. Alright, so before we can talk about the Cult of the Ancestor Moth, we need to cover the moth that the entire cult is based on. In short, ancestor moths, also known as gypsy moths, are indigenous creatures to so-called ancestral glades across Tamriel, which mainly appear in the Jarl Mountains in Cyrodiil, but also in rare other places across Tamriel. The byproduct of these moths is called ancestor silk. This is a special type of silk that the Nibonese Imperials living in northern Cyrodiil traditionally used for crafting and trading. Items made with ancestor silk were sacred to the Nibonese in ancient times. And they collected the ancestor silk by harnessing the song and hymnal vocals of their ancestors through the ancestor moths. This special silk gathering ritual dates back to the very early Nibonese and Cyrodiilic history. Now, there are many reasons for why the Nibonese people take such a pride in revering the ancestor moth and using their silk. For one, wearing clothes and armor made out of ancestral silk lends them a certain sense of unity with their ancestral spirits. Furthermore, it's said that the ancestor moths continuously house or carry the spirits of their ancestors, an ability that supposedly grants wisdom and knowledge to the living. However, many of these ancient traditions seem to have faded in modern Nibonese society, as Cyrodiil became more cosmopolitan and the heart of empires. Now, how does the cult of the ancestor moth factor into all of this? Well, you see, this order, which has the god Julianos as its patron deity, was created to preserve, study and utilize the ancient magics that ancestor moths emit and keep the ancient customs alive in a sense. The Moth Priests venerate the ancestors, believing that the wisdom of the ancestors can sing the future into present. However, after a while of studying the ancestor moths, it was likely discovered that through these moths, skilled priests of the order gain the ability to read the Elder Scrolls, an act regular mortals can only dream of doing. Priests do this through the ritual of the ancestor moth, a ritual that requires precise preparation and immense focus. The ritual can only be performed at so-called ancestral glades that contain canticle trees which attract the ancestor moths. Priests use a drawing knife to cut the bark of a canticle tree. Removing the bark attracts the ancestor moths to the tree, and with enough moths present in the glade, the priest attempting to read the Elder Scrolls gains a second type of sight through the presence of the moths. The role of the moths in this is to serve as a conduit of ancient magic that the priest then uses to decipher the scroll. Except for higher-born mortals like Tiber Septim or the Last Dragonborn, Moth Priests are the only ones who are taught to coherently interpret the harmony of the Elder Scrolls that they're reading. Although every Moth Priest is taught how to perform the ritual of the Ancestor Moth, very few ever end up performing it. You see, the ritual takes immense resilience and practice to be able to interpret and understand the harmony of the scrolls, which is why most Moth Priests never get the chance to perform it. Moreover, it can take months or even years for priests to decipher one single Elder Scroll. Naturally, magical exertion of that proportion takes a toll on the eyes of the Moth Priests, eventually rendering them blind. However, due to the gravity involved in being able to read an Elder Scroll, going blind from reading an Elder Scroll is considered a privilege and honor in the Order, as that would mean that they've served their purpose to help deciphering the scrolls, which are fragments of creation which allow mortals to gain glimpses into the past, possible futures and the present. The Moth Priest's motivation for reading the Elder Scrolls vary. The cult is commonly known for helping the Emperors of Cyrodiil foresee vague interpretations of future events on Tamriel, guiding them in their rule by offering glimpses of possible futures which may help them establish policies or make decisions. The structure of the information present in an Elder Scroll is very intricate and vague, and they're quite literally fragments of time and space that change constantly. Therefore, it's likely that a Moth Priest may never fully decipher and document everything in an Elder Scroll. simply because it always changes and because it's in some cases unknowable. However, their skill in reading the Elder Scrolls and the wisdom that even small glimpses into the future can offer, or at least possible futures, has on more than one occasion helped the forces of good in Tamriel. Moth Priest Daxian Avacus's intervention in Skyrim's Dawnguard DLC, for example, is a great example of how useful their knowledge and skills can be. As for who founded the Order of the Ancestor Moth, that's not entirely clear. The best estimates that we have put the founding of the Order near the end of the First Era or perhaps beginning of the Second Era, during the time of the Riemann Empire, as our records of the Order begin around this time period. But we do know that alongside gaining the ability to read the Elder Scrolls, the Moth Priests are also functioning as the Scroll Keepers of the Empire. As Scroll Keepers, the cult is tasked with making sure that the Elder Scrolls are kept safe in the Imperial Library. Keeping the Elder Scrolls safe though is not a simple task, as there are artifacts that tend to appear and just disappear on their own, and not even the cult themselves know how many Elder Scrolls they have in their possession at one given moment. Besides that, powerful entities across Tamriel always tend to want to get their hands on them, which is yet another variable that the Order has to deal with, as many would like to steal the scrolls for their glimpses into possible futures. However, without proper training, these adversaries would have very little use for many of the scrolls, something that not many seem to understand. Now, moving on, the Order has a very specific ranking system, with most ranks complementing the other ranks. And to give a short overview, the Order has Initiates, Scroll Drudges, Adepts, Abbots and Augurs. Initiates are members that usually take care of retired blind Moth Priests at the Temple of the Ancestor Moths in the Gerald Mountains, which is a sort of retreat where blind Moth Priests are taken care of after having performed their duties all their lives. Initiates also go through training for Elder Scrolls readings in hope that one day they are able to read the Elder Scrolls, although very few in the Order ever attain that ability and have the gift. Now, if an Initiate shows the promise of being able to read an Elder Scroll, they may become an Adept in the Order. Adepts are priests who have the gift to read the Elder Scrolls. Now, many of these Adepts also fulfill different roles, such as becoming Abbots who lead the Ancestor Moth monasteries, and Augurs who are priests who can naturally attract Ancestor Moths. Although those last few roles can also be performed by priests who do not get the ability for reading an Elder Scrolls, just like the rank of Scroll Drudge, which is tasked with retrieving scrolls from the Imperial Library for librarians, which is also a role that can be performed without a gift, as librarians are in charge of the library housing the Elder Scrolls and do not tend to read the scrolls themselves. As such, even members who turn out not to have the gift serve important roles in the Order, and all members can help protect the scrolls and other members, as every member of the Order also learns a specific martial art called the Way of the Peaceful Fist, which can be used to floor those who threaten older priests of the Order and try to steal the Elder Scrolls. To be honest, this martial art may not be much, but it's often enough for the priests to protect themselves and the Order's blind priests. If you want to know more about the Way of the Peaceful Fist and other martial arts on Tamriel, by the way, I recommend watching my video on Tamrielic martial arts, which is in the description of this video. Now, moving on, members can also be grouped based on how good they are able to read the Elder Scrolls, and whether or not they have the gift. There are 4 of these groups: the Knave, the Unguarded Intellect, the Meditated Understanding and the Illuminated Understanding. If a Knave tried to read an Elder Scroll, all they see are odd letters and symbols, meaning that they do not have the gift to become a proper scroll-reading Moth Priest. An Unguarded Intellect can learn from and read an Elder Scroll, but they aren't resilient enough to counter the mind-shattering effects of an Elder Scroll, rendering them blind immediately upon first reading it and sometimes damage their sanity. However, they can still learn a piece of hidden knowledge as a price for their immediate blindness. The final and last 2 groups are resilient enough to read an Elder Scroll for prolonged amounts of time. This allows them to extract more information, but their vision still fades the more they read. Through proper understanding, meditation, training and natural resilience, certain members can reach Meditated Understanding and Illuminated Understanding status. Still, there's no guarantee that an initiate may not immediately go blind, even if they devoted themselves to a decade of isolated meditation and interpretation practice, especially if they don't have the natural aptitude or the gift. Now, as I mentioned before, the vision of a scroll-reading priest may fade gradually, but what they lack in vision they eventually make up for with elevated mental fortitude, and a greater understanding of how to interpret the scrolls and read their language. Although this is a completely mental understanding, as when they translate the runes and they try to read everything down, that's just futile, as it turns out that while they were reading and writing they just wrote down gibberish, which they can only understand in their mind, and not if they write it down directly, so they have to interpret it themselves and translate it themselves. Since the message of an Elder Scroll cannot be fit on paper, as the only tangible message an Elder Scrolls leaves is in the spirit and the soul, which can then be interpreted but never directly told. Now, at some point in a scroll reading Moth Priest's life, the Elder Scroll that they're reading will inform the priest in some way that the next reading that they undertake shall be their last, and this last reading is what the Order usually calls the ultimate reading. Priests usually isolate themselves before this to reflect on their life and prepare for their last revelation. Permanent blindness always follows the last revelation, but a priest who survives all of this tends to gain a higher understanding of life and can describe the information revealed to him in great detail. Lastly, every priest acknowledges that the prophecies that they've seen aren't set in stone. The Order claims that the Elder Scrolls don't hold prophecies until they actually come to pass. To put it simply, the priests gain insight into theoretic events that could come to pass, although no one is sure that they're actually going to happen. If you want to know more about that and how the Elder Scrolls function, I recommend watching this video I did on why the Elder Scrolls are so important and why they aren't at the same time. I explain everything there. Now, regarding the Order's involvement throughout Tamrielic history, they are usually just screwed over by a faction or group that wants what they protect, the Elder Scrolls. Their job to protect the scrolls puts them at the mercy of all three major factions that fought in the Alliance War in the Second Era, for example. These factions, the Daggerfall Covenant, Ebonheart Pact and the Altmerry Dominion, raided the Order, murdering their priests and taking 2 Elder Scrolls each. Future priests would later conclude that this raid had to happen because of how the Elder Scrolls influenced the choices of the aforementioned factions. Choices like that likely aligned with the prophecies in the Elder Scrolls that they managed to glimpse, although we will never actually be sure. Next up, the Order was also involved in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion's Thieves Guild questline, where the player, as the Grey Fox, steals an Elder Scroll from the Imperial Palace from the Moth Priests library. The last major event that the Cult of the Ancestor Moth was loosely involved in was in the Dawnguard questline in Skyrim. The Order became involved in this because in the year 175 of the 4th Era, 26 years before the events of Skyrim and the Dawnguard questline, the Elder Scrolls disappeared from the Imperial Library, leaving the Order in complete disarray as they no longer had any scrolls to study. Upon hearing a rumor that one Elder Scroll had been found in Skyrim, the cult sends the Moth Priest, Daxian Avacus, to Skyrim. Fortunately, Daxian is a Moth Priest who has the gift to read an Elder Scroll, and he can actually help the Last Dragonborn stop the Volkihar clan, which are the enemies on that questline, or the allies, depending on your choices, by reading an Elder Scroll, either voluntary or forced, depending on which side of the conflict you chose. Now, it's safe to say that the Cult of the Ancestor Moth play a minor yet important role in Tamriel's history. Their study into the Elder Scrolls and the glimpses into the future that it brings allows mortals to tap into one of the most unknown and volatile sources of power and wisdom on Tamriel. And because of that, the Order and their priests are the closest link that mortals have to understanding the intricacies of time and creation of Nirn. And their wisdom guides the Emperors of Tamriel, who hope to gain an edge by understanding the future, and as such the Order can influence the course of history in subtle, yet important ways. Alright, and that's basically all I can say about the Moth Priests. Now, for now, let's stay in Cyrodiil, and let's cover the backstory to one of the factions central to one of Oblivion's DLCs, the Knights of the Nine. Let's piece together their backstory and see how war torn this famous band of knights completely apart. So, the Knights of the Nine, a once very famous knightly order in Cyrodiil. Their story started in the year 111 of the Third Era, more than 300 years before the events of Oblivion and 500 years before the events of Skyrim. In this year, one Sir Amiel Lannis, an Imperial Knight who was considered a war hero at the time after taking part in the War of the Isle, which was a naval war taking place around the southwestern parts of Tamriel, where the Sea Elves tried to invade the Somerset Isles, but were defeated by the High Elf and Imperial Navy in combination with magical storms, most likely conjured up by the Psijic Order. This Amiel Lannis returned from this war a hero and a bit of a legend in Cyrodiil, and upon his return to his home province he decided to found his own knightly order, which was to be in service to all 9 divines instead of just one god. This order would be called the Knights of the Nine, and this new knightly order would have the mission of both eradicating evil around Tamriel and finding back the lost Crusaders relics, which were the weapons and armor of the legendary First Era warrior, Pelennor Whitestrake, who was one of the legendary figures who helped Saint Alessia overthrow the Ayleid Empire and who fought with the last Ayleid champion, Umaril the Unfeathered, back in the First Era. For more information on that and the foundation of the Human Empire, watch my video on the Alien Empire and its fall. It's in the description in case you want to know more. Because this video is supposed to be about the Knights of the Nine who came millennia later. Now, these relics would be reclaimed in honor of all the 9 divines, and Sir Amiel recruited some other knightly comrades to join him in this new knightly order and help him search for the relics. Now, these relics, for all terms and purposes, had been lost ever since the First Era, and while many had searched for them, none had been able to find them. Although Sir Amiel seemed to think that this was the best time for him and his knights to try, as in the past century, Tamriel had become more and more peaceful as the Septim Empire united the entire continent. There were very few wars or places where you couldn't relatively easily get, after several centuries of Tamriel-wide chaos in the long interregnum before Tiber Septim came to power and founded the Septim Empire. So Tamriel technically lay wide open and ripe for a search, and thus Sir Amiel and his comrades were optimistic that they would be able to find at least some of these relics and perhaps even all of them. And well, relatively soon they managed to find one. The legend of the Knights of the Nine states that in southern Cyrodiil they defeated a dragon in order to obtain the legendary cuirass of Pelennor Whitestrake. Now, what exactly is true about this legend and whether or not it was really a dragon or just an enhanced legend, we don't know. But since there were some dragons in Second Era elsewhere, it's possible that there was an actual dragon if one from elsewhere survived the first 100 years or so of the Third Era. Who knows? What matters is that they managed to find Pelennor Whitestrake's cuirass, launching their new knightly order into instantaneous fame, and that fame made it so that a ton of knights from all around Tamriel who sought fame and glory all came to Sir Amiel to join up and become part of this emerging but already very famous knightly order. And within just a few years the order became by far the most prestigious knightly order of the Empire, as even knights from very renowned noble families started to join up with the Knights of the Nine. The highlight of these new members was a knight by the name of Sir Beric Findrel, who came from one of the richest and most influential families of all of Cyrodiil and who pledged himself to the order, adding to the order's already extreme prestige around the time. The 9 most famous knights of the time were Sir Amiel, their leader, Sir Beric, perhaps their most famous member, and Sir Casimir, Sir Juncan, Sir Henrik, Sir Caius, Sir Gregory, Sir Ralvas and Sir Torolf. Each of these knights and the lesser members all set out on quests around the Empire to make the Empire safer and, when possible, to search for and claim one of the Crusaders' relics. And over the course of 10 years, they managed to claim a few other relics. Specifically, Sir Beric, their most influential member, managed to find the greaves and sword of the Crusader, and Sir Casimir managed to find the gauntlets of the Crusader. At this point, no one around the Empire doubted that the Knights of the Nine would one day be able to complete the entire set of Crusaders' relics. But despite their successes, as time went on, cracks started to appear in the order, although at first this was mostly masked by their successes. You see, Sir Amiel, their leader, would personally wear the Crusaders' cuirass, and he encouraged others who found Crusaders' relics to do the same, and as such, Sir Casimir would proudly wear the gauntlets, and Sir Beric would wear the greaves and use the sword. But this would prove to be one of the seeds of their downfall, as while Sir Amiel's argument was that these relics were made to vanquish evil and should therefore be used in order to vanquish evil, it made it so that those who had the relics came to see them as their own possessions, and many others strove to get relics simply for the personal pride of being able to wear them, rather than gathering them for the glory of the order or the glory of the divines. This personal pride and their possessiveness over the relics would come to be a deciding factor in the Knights' eventual complete downfall, as 10 years after the order's founding, the order already fell apart. You see, in the year 121 of the Third Era, 10 years after their founding, the Septim Empire itself was plunged into chaos as a deadly civil war, the War of the Red Diamond, swept across the Empire. I made a whole video about that war, but very oversimplified, the Emperor, Antiochus Septim I, died, and then a conflict over the throne started as his heir, Kintura Septim II, ascended to the throne, but her aunt, Potema Septim, yes, that Potema that we can fight in Skyrim, disputed her claim and tried to get her son, the eventual Emperor Uriel Septim III, on the throne. This conflict plunged Tamriel into a bloody civil war, which divided the nobility between supporting the two claimants to the throne. I made a whole video about the conflict, so watch that if you want to know more. But what's important for this video is that it's at this point that the extreme prestige and noble membership of the Knights of the Nine came to bite them, as many of the members of the order came from noble families which either wanted to or were forced to choose a side in the war. And while Sir Amiel tried to keep things together and tried to keep the Knights of the Nine as a neutral party in the war, many of his most influential members were forced to leave to fight in the conflict, as their families chose a side and they needed to fulfill duties to their families or oaths to their lieges. The first member to leave for war also did the most damage, as it was Sir Beric, the knight whose membership actually added most of their prestige. He decided to leave for war and planned to bring the Sword of the Crusader and the Greaves with him into war. On the day that he left, Sir Amiel and Sir Caius tried to stop him from leaving, and when Sir Beric could not be convinced, Sir Caius tried to attack him, trying to force him to stay. At least that's the common interpretation, because centuries later, when we learn Sir Beric's side of the story, we learn that Sir Beric said that he felt evil and pride take himself over and that he tried to provoke Sir Caius into a fight. Meanwhile, Sir Caius would blame his own lack of temper control. Maybe it was just a bit of both. But whatever the truth is, Sir Caius was beaten by Sir Beric and he was killed on the steps of the Priory of the Nine using the Sword of the Crusader. This violent display in their own headquarters shook the Knights of the Nine to their core, and many knights would follow Sir Beric, leaving the knighthood. And with this official split, the knights were severely weakened. Now, while most people in Tamriel put the end of their story here, the Knights of the Nine actually continued to exist for a while longer, even during the War of the Red Diamond. While their membership slowly bled dry, it's said that some knights still did good things for the people of the Empire, and other knights, in attempts to reclaim the glory of the Order and attain personal glory, still tried to collect more Crusaders' relics, despite the fact that they would never again be complete, at least as long as Sir Beric had taken the sword and greaves and he would not return to the Order. For example, at this time, Sir Ralphus tried to recover the Mace of the Crusader, Sir Juncan tried to reclaim the boots, and Sir Henrik actually managed to recover the Shield of the Crusader. But all of that mostly ended in failure and tragedy, as Sir Ralphus was driven basically mad by the trial of Zenithar, which was required to claim the Mace, Sir Juncan died before ever reaching the boots, and while Sir Henrik did find the shield, he was forced to hide it, as apparently it was not safe in the outside world. In these years, the Order's membership slowly bled dry, and while Sir Amiel tried to keep what remained together, probably the final nail in the coffin was the fall of Sir Casimir. You see, Sir Casimir, who in years prior had found the gauntlets of the Crusader, had left for war to fight the forces of Potema. When he returned from his war efforts, he found the knights to be but a shadow of their former self and never rejoined. Instead, he went to Corel, where he went to the chapel of Stendar, the god of mercy. Now, while staying in the chapel, a local beggar kept asking him for aid, and he refused to give him aid every single time, until there came a point where he got so fed up and annoyed with the beggar that he killed him in cold blood on the chapel floor. He didn't mean to kill him, but he hit him so hard that the beggar was dead. And it was at this point that Stendar cursed him and his family for this heinous act, and that the gauntlets left him, falling from his hands and becoming too heavy to pick up by anyone. This event most likely was the final nail in the coffin for the knights' reputation, and thus, when the war ended and Sir Beric, who returned home victorious from the war, and with a whole boatload of new political influence in the government to boot, he was able to pass an imperial law officially banning the Knights of the Nine out of existence, outlawing the Order. In truth, this wasn't really necessary and purely symbolic, as the Knights of the Nine had long since become irrelevant, as by that time the Order only consisted of one old man in a forgotten priory, Sir Amiel, the original founder, because he was the only one left. The Order had fallen, the Knights had died or left, and the relics had been scattered, and the Knights faded into history. In a depressed and defeated state, Sir Amiel remained at the Priory of the Nine for years, the last stubborn knight of a failed order. And during this time he blamed Sir Beric for everything that had gone wrong, considering him an enemy, if anything. As long after the war, Sir Amiel and Sir Beric were the only ones remaining, with all other knights dead, with Sir Amiel depressed in a priory and Sir Beric in a high imperial government position. Sir Amiel would dedicate the last years of his life to retrieving the bodies of former knights who died, even Sir Casimir, who had dishonored himself in the chapel, and he brought their bodies to the crypt below the Priory of the Nine, laying them to rest with their former brothers in arms, all except Sir Beric. When he had retrieved all the bodies and entombed them, Sir Amiel would set out from the Priory on one last quest, a quest to try and retrieve the helm of the Crusader, in order to, in his mind at least, redeem the Order from its past failures, even though he knew that he was too frail and old to do it at that point. He died, and with him the knights died, although all of their spirits remained, as the spirits of all the knights, including Sir Amiel, but except Sir Beric, would remain in the crypt below the priory to guard the only Crusader's relic that the Order had left by the end, the Cuirass of the Crusader. During our questing in the Knights of the Nine, we can discover this story and we can speak to their spirits. We find that most of them are steeped in regrets one way or another, like Sir Casimir, who deeply regrets slaying the beggar, and we can help them move on. We can even redeem Sir Beric by slaying his Wraith, who, despite his actions in the past, longs to rest and pass into Aetherius with his former brothers in arms. We can then reconcile the old friends, with Sir Beric and Sir Amiel both admitting their past mistakes, and then, with all their former brothers, stepping into the afterlife as friends, while leaving the fate of the Knights of the Nine to us as the player. And that was the story of the original Knights of the Nine, a quite tragic story, and it's sad that something which began so gloriously would end in such a way. But that's simply what happens when ambition and pride takes over. Anyway, that's about all I can say about the Knights of the Nine for today's video. And next up, let's talk about another fan favorite faction, specifically a faction of vampires, but this time not evil vampires per se. Specifically, let's talk about Tamriel's House of Friendly Vampires, House Ravenwatch. So, House Ravenwatch. As said in the intro, they are a house of non-evil vampires who look to control their evil and bloodthirsty urges and instead live peacefully alongside mortals. The vampires of this house see their vampirism and the powers and perks that come with it not as a curse, but rather as a gift which can be used for the betterment of everyone, including non-vampires. They see themselves not as monsters and aren't ashamed for their vampirism. They think that if vampires can somehow control their urges, they can actually be really useful for society. For example, their virtual immortality means that they can dedicate themselves to causes such as magical and alchemical research, having several lifetimes to come to advance the field. In a similar vein, their vampiric powers and their resistance to diseases and many types of other evil magic makes them especially fit to fight such evil magic. This is why, next to helping the community through stuff like research and brewing potions for the sick, the members of House Ravenwatch also travel all across Tamriel to fight other evil vampires, and if possible, they will always try to convince the vampire that they defeat to stray away from their evil path and come with them, in order to have themselves trained against their evil urges. Killing other vampires is always a last resort for the members of the house, no matter what they have done, as the members of House Ravenwatch know all too well that vampirism can lead individuals to evil deeds if they are not properly trained to resist them. As such, they believe that almost all deserve a second chance at redemption. However, they are not above killing other vampires as a last resort, if for example these vampires gave up trying to control themselves or show no intention or willingness to change. Now, if a vampire is found by a member of the house, they will be taken to Castle Ravenwatch, a castle in a remote part of northern High Rock, where the members of House Ravenwatch assemble and are trained. The initiate is then kept at the castle and trained by another member of the house. They are free to roam the castle, but they need to remain inside at least until their training is completed and that they can prove that they can control their urges. Now, one particular problem that the house has to deal with is that part of being a vampire involves having to regularly consume blood, mortal blood to be specific, because if a vampire doesn't consume blood for too long, then they will eventually lose their mind and become feral vampires. In order to deal with this problem, House Ravenwatch actually pays local mortals to basically donate their blood to the house, and sometimes they even host willing mortals at their castle that allow the vampires to feed on them in exchange for money, goods or services. It's all done on a transactional or voluntary basis, as the vampires of House Ravenwatch do not enthrall mortals for this purpose. New initiates are taught how to feed on these willing mortals in the least painful way that doesn't infect them and with moderation so that the mortals don't lose too much blood. It's hinted at that new initiates will have to undergo several tests in order to prove themselves that they can actually control their urge for blood and their evil tendencies. When they finish their training and they have proved themselves, the leader of House Ravenwatch will adopt them into the house as a full-fledged member, after which the member is free to go wherever they want, as long as they dedicate themselves to peaceful coexistence with mortals. Although many members actually tend to stay behind with the other members and also dedicate themselves to the house's second cause, combating evil vampires and helping the mortals of the world using their gifts. Now, for some history, the house was founded somewhere in the First Era by the High Elf vampire Verandis Ravenwatch. You see, Verandis was once part of the Grey Council and the Grey Host, a faction which definitely deserves its own video and plays a big role in the Skyrim DLCs of the Elder Scrolls Online. But in short, the Grey Host was an alliance of vampires, werewolves and other supernatural beings, with which Verandis assumed that he would be able to do a lot of good, until it became clear that the Grey Host was getting warped and started committing evil deeds, which led him to leaving the Grey Host, realizing his mistake to join them, and he then tried to find a new purpose. He then found that new purpose in the founding of House Ravenwatch in Northern High Rock, his own organization of vampires that he would dedicate to controlling their vampiric urges, combating evil vampires, and with the long-term goal of getting accepted by the mortals of the world as a normal part of the community. Now, over the centuries, he definitely succeeded in this, at least to a degree. While he never advertised his house as being vampires all that much to all the mortals of the world, he never shied away from the fact either, being honest to all mortals that he met. Eventually, he also connected with the local nobility of the region. Being upfront about his situation from the get-go, they were quite wary of him, but over the centuries, the local Breton nobility of High Rock actually warmed up to Verandis and House Ravenwatch. And when the region was united for a while under a king somewhere in the late 1st or early 2nd era, the king of the region even bestowed the title of Count upon Verandis and made his house, House Ravenwatch, an official noble house of High Rock, as a reward for their contributions to the region. House Ravenwatch was very respected during this period. While not all the citizens of High Rock knew about their vampirism due to the prejudice against vampire kind, it was kind of an open secret among all the nobles who held connections with House Ravenwatch and the mortal peasants living in Castle Ravenwatch's environs. Now, over the centuries, Verandis also garnered quite the reputation as a learned man, using his long lifespan to become a respected scholar of history, a history that he, for a large part, actually personally lived through. The nobles of the region would even start sending their own children to Castle Ravenwatch to be educated by Verandis, which kind of shows how much trust there was in him and his mission. Among these children sent to study at the castle was Emeric of Cumberland, the same kid who would later grow up to become High King Emeric of the Daggerfall Covenant. And as such, Count Verandis Ravenwatch became one of his childhood tutors and a lifelong trusted friend and ally. Count Verandis was among the first nobles of High Rock to support Emeric's claim to the throne, and he also used his influence in Northern High Rock to sway the nobles to Emeric's side. Count Verandis was quite influential and respected at this time, and even those who didn't like him tended not to dislike him for his vampirism, but rather for the fact that he tended to be quite cautious and not quick to act. And in some cases they even disliked him for the fact that he wouldn't purposefully infect them with vampirism, as that was against the rules of his house. Now, during our playtime in the Elder Scrolls Online, we can meet several members of House Ravenwatch who play significant roles in several questlines and quests, which, in my opinion, mostly all range from pretty good to really good questlines, so I can definitely recommend you playing them. We can meet almost all of the gang's prominent members in the main questline of the Rivenspire region in Northern High Rock, in which the Ravenwatch clan plays a significant part in dealing with the threat of the region. There we first meet Count Verandis, the wise leader, the second in command, the Khajiiti Adusadaro, and the aspiring young vampire member Gwendis. During that questline we can actually help recruit several new members into the fray as well. Now, each of the members would appear again later in DLC stories, especially in the Western Skyrim and Markarth DLCs, which are all centered around vampires, and as such, House Ravenwatch makes quite some heavy contributions to these storylines, including one of their newest members, a high elf vampire named Fenorian, who is hands down one of my favorite characters, not least due to his voice actor. Anyway, I will probably cover each of those questlines in the future, as I'm trying to cover most Elder Scrolls Online questlines at some point for people who don't want to play the game but want to know the stories, but for now all I can say is Rivenspire, Western Skyrim, Markarth, at least worth playing, especially in that order. Either way, by the end of our playtime, Verandis will have ceded the title of leader of House Ravenwatch to his second in command, the Khajiiti Adusadaro. And if we have played all of the content with the House Ravenwatch, he will also officially adopt us into House Ravenwatch as a member for all that we have done, whether we are a vampire or not. And to be honest, knowing the story and the characters of the house, it's actually one of my favorite in-game titles to have in the Elder Scrolls Online, because you can have the title of House Ravenwatch with your character, which is pretty cool. Now, we don't know the current status of House Ravenwatch in further eras. It can be assumed that they may still have survived and carry out their mission into the 3rd and 4th eras, but to be honest, We just don't know. Considering the general population isn't aware of their identities as vampires, and considering that we can't even visit the region that they are based in the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, that means that there is no evidence for either their existence or non-existence in later eras, and yet I personally really like this faction, so my personal headcanon is that they're still sticking around, but that's a question only future games may answer. Anyway, that's about all I can say about House Ravenwatch. Now next up, let's talk about a group of assassins, but not the Dark Brotherhood or the Morak Tong. Specifically, let's talk about a group of assassins who were traitors to both the Dark Brotherhood and the Morak Tong, the so-called Silken Ring, whose story, in my opinion, is pretty interesting. So, the Silken Ring, a mysterious band of assassins that existed in Morrowind around the middle of the Second Era, during the time of the Elder Scrolls Online. They are a group comprised of ex-Morak Tong members, ex-Dark Brotherhood members, and ex-members of the Shadow Scales, which is a group of legendary Argonian assassins that I made a video on a while back. If you want to know more about them, I put a video in the description. These ex-assassins formed themselves a new group under the leadership of ex-Morak Tong assassin and worshipper of the Daedric prince Mephala, Dranos Velador, who secretly recruited members from existing assassin guilds before they declared themselves openly as the Silken Ring, a new assassin guild. Their patron deity would be the Daedric prince Mephala, and their kills would be undertaken in her name. The group was based in an ancient imperial ruin, which once served as a hidden outpost for the imperial agents of the Reman Empire. The outpost was connected to caverns deep under the outpost, and over time, once the Reman Empire had abandoned it, it became infested with Mephala's Daedric minions, after which the outpost and caverns came to be called the Cradle of Shadows. Among those minions of Mephala in the Cradle, there was a large sentient spider Daedra named Veladreth. This spider Daedra led the minions in the cavern, and when the Silken Ring moved into the caverns, in order to use it as their base of operation, this large spider Daedra was the one who served as Mephala's mouthpiece to the Silken Ring, letting them know Mephala's will. Only members of the Silken Ring know what and who she really is, calling her the Lady of Lace to outsiders. Together with Dranos Velador, she led the group of assassins, and it was through her that members of the Silken Ring obtained powerful Daedric magic to work with. The assassins of the Silken Ring wore silver masks, apparently partly made using human hair and spider silk, which resembled human heads without mouths and with narrow squinting eyes, inspired by Mephala herself. In their kills, it said that they were particularly ruthless and that their assassins did not just use daggers but a whole variety of weapons and destruction magic. The manner which to join the Silken Ring was as ruthless as the assassin organization itself, as joining the Silken Ring demanded that you kill one of your friends or close comrades in front of members of the Silken Ring to prove your loyalty and trustworthiness for the group. Anyway, the Silken Ring during its existence was for the most part seen as a simple embarrassment to the guilds that had lost members to them, with many Morak Tong particularly being outraged about the existence of the Silken Ring, as it put a great shame to the Morak Tong at their place in Morrowind society. The Dark Brotherhood and the Shadow Scales were also all but happy with the existence of the Silken Ring, seeing their existence as an affront to their values and rules. At first, however, the organization was not really seen as a threat to the other established assassin organizations, just seeming like a small splinter group of defectors which would eventually die out by itself. But the contrary happened. Using the allure of powers granted to the Silken Ring assassins by Mephala, the Daedric prince, the organization grew and grew as more assassins defected to the Silken Ring from the Morak Tong, the Dark Brotherhood and the Shadow Scales, being seduced by the Daedric powers that were promised to them once they joined. Next to their headquarters at the Cradle of Shadows, the Silken Ring eventually held several smaller outposts across Morrowind. So they became a quite large organization and supposedly carried out kills for paying employers, but that's a bit vague. Because it also could be that they just carried out Mephala's will. Their exact objectives as a group are a bit vague in the lore. But eventually something happened. As the Silken Ring became bigger and bigger, they suddenly started targeting assassins from the Morak Tong, the Shadow Scales and the Dark Brotherhood, essentially killing off the competition. And not only that, they also started targeting informants in the field of these organizations, essentially sabotaging their way of operations. They were trying to get rid of the other organizations in Morrowind, and at that point they became too much to ignore for the established assassin organizations. The Shadow Scales were the first to take action, as a large group of these Argonian assassins set out to purge the Cradle of Shadows and put an end to the Silken Ring. However, the group of assassins they sent to deal with the Silken Ring was betrayed by their leader, who ended up having them ambushed and killed so that he could join the Silken Ring himself, killing his second-in-command personally in front of the Silken Ring as his rite of passage into their ranks. This is how you, as the player, can find the situation, with an Argonian Dark Brotherhood assassin sneaking around the Cradle of Shadows looking to eliminate the Silken Ring all by herself, and find out what happened to the Ambush Shadow skills and their leader. You as the player can help her out and discover the betrayal, which led to all the Shadow skills eventually being ambushed and killed, and their leader being admitted into the Silken Ring. You can then help put an end to the Silken Ring by killing their leader, Dranos Felidor, and putting down the Daedric Spider, Felidreth, which renders the organization leaderless and without their connection to Mephala. With many assassins killed by you and without their leader, it's assumed that the Silken Ring is destroyed after the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, but regardless, I found this to be a pretty cool faction, as it basically merged ex-assassins from all the major assassin groups that we know of, which, I don't know, I found a cool concept. Pretty neat stuff overall, and I hope that we get to see them or an organization like them comprised of deserters from multiple assassin guilds again in the future expansions or in the Elder Scrolls 6 when that eventually launches. And that's about all I can say about the Silken Ring. Now, let's talk now about a faction from both Morrowind and the Elder Scrolls Online, specifically the Dunmer Seductress tribe, the so-called Mabrigash tribe, whose story is more interesting than you may think. So, the Mabrigash tribe. They are a tribe of Ashlanders who are quite different from your regular Ashlanders. In the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind we can encounter them mostly as enemies, and they are described to be outcasts of the other Ashlander tribes, mostly outcast wise women who have all banded together into a makeshift tribe, and they are said to practice dark and forbidden snake magic. Now, the females of this tribe, which make up the vast majority of its members, go out into the world to Morrowind cities and villages, and there they seduct men, leading them away to their camps, only to then use their strange snake magic to paralyze their victims and drain them of their life force, and apparently use this life force to then extend their own life. This is why in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind we mostly just encounter them as enemies, as we can't really speak to them, and we generally just have to try and save their victims from their camps. However, we have gotten quite some new lore on their society and origins. To start, the females of the tribe are not just in the majority, they also lead the tribe, with a female member of the tribe titled the Farseer, said to be able to have glimpses into the future, leading the tribe in the stead of a traditional Ashlander Ashkan, which is the title of a male leader of the regular Ashlander tribes. Now, sometimes in its history the Mabrigash have had male Ashkans, as they do have some male members of the tribe, but they are ranked below the females, and the Ashkan, while a strong warrior, has no real decision-making power in Mabrigash society. That decision-making power all lies with the Farseer and the Wise Women. And their general disdain for men goes a little bit further. You see, the tribe is made out of outcasts of other tribes, as I said, mostly wise women from other tribes who have been cast out of their original tribe. However, often when a wise woman is cast out of their previous tribe, they often take people with them, their followers, for example their lovers, children, close friends, fellow outcasts, those kind of people. That's generally the only way a man seems to be able to become part of the Mabrigash tribe, if he comes as a part of the retinue of a former wise woman. Girls and women are generally always seemingly welcome, but men, they can only become a member if a former wise woman vouches for them and brought them along. This is because they distrust men in general. Why? We don't exactly know. However, we can see this in action ourselves when we approach their clan in the Elder Scrolls Online, as a woman character you'll generally be treated quite well and they'll be nice to you, but if you're a man everybody will just be rude, and if you aren't respectful they will tie you up and sacrifice you to their deity. Pretty fun stuff. But talking about that deity, the Mabrigash tribe is quite different in its religious practices to most other Dunmer, because they worship this strange snake spirit, commonly called the Ghost Snake, which is also the entity which gives them their strange magical powers that we see them use in the Elder Scrolls Morrowind, as they are called Ghost Snake powers, which is the strange forbidden snake magic. This Ghost Snake is strange. It's an intelligent spirit living in the marshes of southern Morrowind, close to the Mabrigash tribe's main camp, which is also in the region. What exactly this spirit is, we don't know. It seems to have godlike powers, or at least is very powerful, and it does appreciate the tribe's worship of him, and he's happy to bestow wisdom upon the members of the tribe, but he doesn't really seem to have any goals of his own. When we get the privilege to speak to the Ghost Snake, he reveals to us that he believes in the ultimate duality, that everything has a second side, everything has a truth and a lie, and everything is destined to change no matter how we attempt to preserve it. Now, that belief in change has led some to speculate that he may be some sort of aspect of Sithis, but the Ghost Snake also seems to have great care for the tribe and for the world itself. So I'm not really sure about the whole Sithis thing. He may just be a powerful spirit of sorts and not really a god or a deity and just happened to come across a tribe which then started worshipping him. We don't really know. Anyway, what we do know is that the Ghost Snake also lies at the origins of the tribe, as back in the First Era, a group of Ashlander outcasts, which was led by a wise woman named Hareth, had all fled their original Ashlander tribe after war and famine had devastated their original tribe. They traveled through Morrowind, and one day their leader, Hareth, then one day heard the Ghost Snake in her dreams, leading her to becoming the first Farseer of the tribe as she led the band of outcasts to what would become the Vale of the Ghost Snake, which is the area where they settled, in close proximity to their new deity. Now, the Ghost Snake then taught them their new snake magic powers, and he also taught them how to extend their life and gain power by absorbing the powers of others, which at this point they didn't do to just anyone, they just did it to those coming into their territory or invading the territory of the Ghost Snake, which they saw as holy. Now, in the years since, the tribe has made a whole religion around the Ghost Snake, and they send new members and those who come of age to visit the Ghost Snake, which has taken residence in a shrine that they built to him. The Ghost Snake then reveals to these visitors some essential truths about life and their place in the world, after which they become a full member of the tribe. However, this visiting of the Ghost Snake is not just a religious practice, it's also a proving trial of sorts, as the shrine in which the snake has taken residence is located at the end of the so-called Coiled Path, a holy path through the swamps filled with danger, such as gigantic serpents and the ghosts of those who fell in the attempt to reach the Ghost Snake in years past. By braving the path, the members prove their mettle, and then by speaking to the Ghost Snake, they attain their wisdom. This coiled path, the shrine and the Mabrigash camp together make up that small sub-region that they call the Vale of the Ghost Snake. This region is desolate, and in the lore it's far away from most civilization, and it's mostly just populated by bog rats, swamp serpents and other swamp creatures. The tribe feeds itself by hunting the swamp serpents for their meat, their teeth and their skins. The meat they use to feed themselves, however the fangs and skin they use to craft their clothes and religious items in worship of the Ghost Snake. However, they hunt only as much as they need for survival, as they respect the Ghost Snake's teachings and they have some level of reverence for regular snakes as well. Now, using the skin of the snakes that they do hunt, they can actually craft a strange and extremely strong type of snake leather. This snake leather is actually the primary reason that we get to visit the Ghost Snake's Vale, as we're entering the Mabrigash camp to try and rescue a Hlalu trader who came to trade for the snake leather but then ended up being tied up and ready for sacrifice to the Ghost Snake, as he kept insulting the leading Farseer and the wise woman, which isn't a good idea in these kind of tribes. Especially since by the Second Era the Mabrigash tribe are extremely reclusive and paranoid of the outside world, rarely leaving the Vale of the Ghost Snake and being cautious of trading with outsiders as they are very afraid of change, despite change being in the Ghost Snake's teachings and values. Now, we can help free the trader in the game, talk to the Ghost Snake in the process, who then tells us to help the tribe make a decision on whether or not they wish to open up to the outside world. In his view, no matter whether they open up or not, this accident with the trader has already led to a sequence of events in which the tribe will be subject to change, as all things in the world, so he doesn't really care whether or not they open up to the world, as nothing changes about his values, since change is in his values. It seems that in the end, no matter our choices, they did open up to the world, as by the Third Era we can find Mabrigash in several places around Morrowind, where they use their powers, that they used to use just on the invaders of the Vale, to steal other people's lives' essence, specifically men that they seduct around Morrowind. It's likely that since by the Third Era they all still have their snake magic, that the Vale is still populated by Mabrigash, who protect the area and still worship the Ghost Snake, but they have opened up by the Third Era and they send their members across Morrowind. And that was about all I can say about the Mabrigash tribe. Now next up we will talk about one of my personal favorite factions, specifically a faction of feudal crows from the plane of Oblivion of Daedric Prince Nocturnal. We're talking of course about the Blackfeather court. These guys, or rather crows, are amazing, as you will see. The Evergloam is the realm of the Daedric Prince Nocturnal, mistress of the night and darkness. In her realm she has many different Daedric creatures, from spiders to bats and shrieks. But one of her more interesting creatures live in a pocket realm of the Evergloam called the Crow's Wood, a sort of semi-separate realm from Nocturnal's own realm. The Crow's Wood as a separate realm was originally likely created by a hagraven-like nether niece of Nocturnal called the Crow Mother. This Crow Mother, however, who had created this pocket realm of Crow's Wood, which was basically a thick forest mixed with swamp elements, she started to feel lonely in this realm, where she only had Nocturnal's primitive beasts to keep her company. Using her own power, she then devised a solution. She created Daedric crows and taught them to talk in order to keep her company. She created many of these crows, but made one crow smarter, bigger and louder than the rest, upon which, according to this crow himself, she made him the leader of the newly created flock, after which he became the Duke of Crows. This flock of birds kept her busy for many years, but at some point the Crow Mother got so tired with them, as the crows bore many elements that she hadn't accounted for in her creation of them, because the crows were always cawing, were wanting for objects, shiny objects in particular, to hoard. Eventually she became so tired of the crows that she retired herself to a tower in the Crow's Wood, only concerning herself with her own experiments and leaving the Crow's Wood open to the crows and whomever or whatever else was there, which mostly came in the form of Nocturnal's Daedric bats, wolves and other creatures. The crows, however, saw her retiring to the tower as the Crow's Mother giving them dominion over the woods, giving them the right to rule it. Quickly after this, a feudal system came in place, led by the Duke and his aristocracy. The realm would be ruled over by a feudal court called the Blackfeather court, and they proudly claimed rule over the realm. This feudal system became ever more elaborate until many crows had attained special titles and higher and lower ranks on the crow aristocracy. The realm, while formally ruled over by the Duke, greatest crow of them all, was practically administered by his left and right hands, or well, left and right wings, which are the Seneschal of Carrion and the Court of Castellan. Both these crows operate day-to-day operations of the court to keep the court functioning. The Seneschal of Carrion is the Duke's steward and administers the treasures and blood offers made to the Duke. Because you see, over the years, many mortals have accidentally or on purpose set foot in the Crow's Wood, after which they always needed to pay tribute to the court in order to be allowed passage. This tribute must come in the form of aid in the war effort against the giant wolves or bats, or must come in the form of treasure, specifically shiny tributes offered to the Duke. Once the Seneschal of Carrion has collected tribute, he passes the shinies to the Bursar of Tributes, essentially the court's Minister of Finance, who will add it all to the shiny objects hoard of the court. If one does not comply with the tribute, then a mortal shall have the wrath of the court upon them, specifically the wrath of the Duke, which mostly comes in the form of incessant cawing, packing, and of course having bird shit land on your head. These retributions for non-payers are handled by the Court Castellan. While the Seneschal of Carrion is in charge of domestic affairs, the Castellan is in charge of the court's military, coming in the form of the court's knights and knaves, of which we have several named individuals. There is of course the Great Knight of Marrow, greatest Crow Knight. There is the Knight of Pith, the Knight of Gore, and the Knight of Virtuous. Lower members of the military are the Knaves, of which the most well known is the Knave of Rooks, but there's also the Knave of Pipes and the Knave of Ravens. Elisa Rervom, a Tamrielic scholar who has investigated the Crow's Wood, says that with all these things surrounding the court, there really appears to be more attention paid to pomp and circumstance than to accomplishing anything of substance. The crows seem much more to enjoy the role-playing of a court and conspiring, plotting and politicking for status and favor than actually ruling the land and doing something about the giant bats and wolves whom populate the realm and who, according to the Duke, the court is at constant war with. The court is truly a medieval aristocracy in many ways, with knights courting fair maidens, taking on squires and all kind of other inefficient rituals. As player, it's possible to become a citizen of the realm of Crow's Wood by delivering a tribute to the Duke during the quest Decree of Court. As a reward for your tribute, you become a citizen and get your own crow servants to summon. It's just a memento which you can use to summon some crows that pick dead bodies clean, but I mean, it's your brethren, so it's my favorite memento in the game. This was their story up until the Clockwork City expansion. However, when the Daedric mistress Nocturnal started scheming against Sothasil in his Clockwork City, the court was called upon by Nocturnal to help scout the city, together with Nocturnal's own crows, the Exarchs of Dross, whom Nocturnal herself presumably created, or who were also created by the Crow Mother, but then somehow got into the service of a Nocturnal, while the Blackfeather court themselves remained independent. The court answered Nocturnal's call and went through her portals towards the Clockwork City. But once the court had arrived in the city and the Duke saw all the shiny objects in the Clockwork City, he proclaimed that none but he as Duke could rule the court. Not even Nocturnal could command them. So he had the court revolt and set aside their objectives and set a new objective to conquer the Clockwork City for the court and amass a whole new massive horde of shinies. They positioned themselves in an abandoned section of the Brass Fortress, the main city of the Clockwork City, and immediately started harassing the citizenry of the rest of the city by packing them, cawing at them, and countless incidents of, well, bird shit. The domain was to be theirs, and they also started demanding tribute, which nobody gave them, of course. So they just started taking the tribute themselves, stealing many trinkets from the denizens of the Clockwork City. This mission of conquering the city, however, more or less out of accident, conflicted with Nocturnal's attempt to take down Sotasil, as for her plan she needed the skeleton key, a key that could open and close any lock, and she could use it to lock Sotasil into his meditation machine. Nocturnal conspired with one of the Clockwork City's human rulers, Chancellor Gascoigne, but it just so happened that the Blackfeather court doesn't really see Gascoigne as a legitimate ruler, as the Duke is the ruler of the city. So, of Chancellor Gascoigne, they also demanded tribute. Chancellor didn't give it to them, so they stole something of the Chancellor. And they stole the skeleton key from the Chancellor's office and then claimed it as a shiny for their horde. Nocturnal, who hadn't really cared about the Blackfeather court until this point, now sent her own crows, the Exarchs of Dross, also a feudal group of crows, but under the rule of a female crow called the Queen of Chaff, to retrieve the skeleton key from the court. The Queen came to parley with the Duke, but the Duke refused to give up this great shiny. He did not know what it was, but he was not gonna surrender it to Nocturnal's bootlickers. Thus started the war with the Exarchs of Dross in the Clockwork City. Both parties fought fiercely, but ultimately the Blackfeather court won this heroic war with the Exarchs, with the help of a featherless giant who was squire to the Great Knight of Marrow, which is you, the player. With your help, the Duke manages to force the Queen of Chaff into formal surrender and have her recognize his rule over the realm. The Duke then decides to reward you with the skeleton key, which, as you will see in the video on the Clockwork City, was your objective to begin with, speaking to the Duke. However, Nocturnal's minions ambush you before you can take the key, and the Duke and the Knight of Marrow are there as well. The Knight of Marrow, your liege, then dies in the ensuing battle against Nocturnal's minions, and the key gets stolen. The Duke then makes the player an honorary member of the court and decides that the murder of his most esteemed knight is not to be forgotten and is not to be forgiven. It is time to declare war upon Nocturnal. So he vows to you that he and the court will help you stop Nocturnal's schemes. The court then helps the player enter the Evergloam and defeat several key minions, after which the player can stop Nocturnal's schemes against Sotasil. If you want to know the exact story of Nocturnal's scheme against Sotasil and the court's great war against the Exarchs and the fearsome motionless guardian, I recommend you watch the video on the Clockwork City questline, which is in the description. I don't really think copy-pasting my script from there would be very efficient, so you can just watch that. We don't exactly know what will happen to the court after the Clockwork City DLC. They might at some point return to the Crow's Wood with their new horde, or they might remain in the city for some time, enjoying their new dominion over the city. I suppose only time will tell. But I, for one, hope that we will encounter the court again in some future DLC, or maybe Elder Scrolls 6, because even this video doesn't really do justice to how funny and awesome this faction of pompous crows is, as they aren't just comedic relief, but also have some pretty good story behind them. Alright, but now let's talk about another faction, specifically a faction of artists and performers who all go through life wearing a mask, the House of Reveries, a faction which really does contain some of Tamriel's greatest artists. So, as said before in the intro, the House of Reveries is a legendary group of performers that consists only out of the best artists, musicians, dancers and other performing artists one can find around Tamriel, specifically the Somerset Isles. They take in only the very best, making them a group of grand status and immense talent. However, while their talent definitely sets them apart from other troops of artists, there is one definitive trait that sets all the artists in the House of Reveries apart. They perform anonymously. They perform under stage names and wear masks so that none in the audience will ever know their true self. Nor does anyone from their previous life or career know their new stage names or their admittance into the House of Reveries. You see, the goal of the House of Reveries is that only the best artists with a genuine love for their craft can join, and the way to test this is by having them cast aside all that they previously achieved, and having them cast aside their entire personal identity. This is so they can completely focus on the performance and have the enjoyment of the audience be completely caused by the performance and not by the looks or status of the performer. One joins the House of Reveries not to become famous or to make money or to get status. One only joins the house to further their craft and share it with the world. Their stage name will become their new name, their alias will become their new identity, and the old famous performer will be cast aside and forgotten. They will wear 1,000 faces but will never show their own. They will become the persona that they have chosen, which could mean altering their personality, looks or even gender. This creed was dictated by the founder of the House of Reveries, a legendary performer who went by the stage name of Grand Maestro Ingress. According to official House of Reveries history, she was a great performer once, an elf of noble intentions and likely noble heritage. She had significant wealth to her name after a long and successful career of performance. All her life she honed her performance skills and performed in many disciplines herself, apart from dancing. She also went with singing, drama, and according to legend she even tried her hand at juggling, as she held great respect towards all performers, high and low, from the humblest street beggar juggling to the ultimate noble honing their skills for centuries. It's said that when she got older, however, she got more and more dissatisfied with many of her fellow performers. She realized that many of them simply performed to gain wealth, power, notoriety, or influence. As her life went on, it's said that she well saw this darkness spreading to more and more performers, until she'd had enough and reflected on what she could do to change the troubling trend that she could see happening in front of her eyes. She then decided to found a new troupe of artists, one without a care for monetary rewards, influence, or anything like that. This group would live solely for the thrill of the stage. She cast aside her former identity and took up a mask to perform in anonymity, requiring all those that joined the troupe to do the exact same thing. The original identities of the performers would be forever hidden, and all those who took off their mask would be expelled from the group. And thus the House of Reveries was born, and over time more and more dedicated artists joined this troupe over the centuries, until it had become one of the most famous artist troupes on all of Tamriel. Over time the group became larger, with more and more artists joining their ranks, and eventually the troupe established themselves in the Somerset town of Valentil, where they built several facilities for their members and a grand amphitheater for their performances. On this stage in Valentil, the majority of the shows organized by the troupe take place. However, as time went on, the House of Reveries also started sending out wandering groups of artists, which traveled all of Somerset and Tamriel, organizing their shows in other places as well. When on the road, such a traveling troupe does not take any servants with them. Each member of the traveling troupe is expected to pull their weight and care for the horses, cook, dig out latrines and unpack the wagons. Even the highest ranking members, from the Grand Maestro of the entire House of Reveries or the regular Maestro which leads a caravan, to the most lowly member of the troupe, none is better than the other, and each are expected to live solely for the stage and not for the command of servants or to have, their pains eased. While a life like this, at least to me, doesn't seem all too attractive, the auditions to join the House of Reveries are said to be quite well visited, with many artists coming from all across Tamriel. They hold auditions 4 times a year, 1 session for each season, and an audition takes a few weeks, and during that time anyone can jump on the stage and try to join. Once you jump on the stage, you will be observed by 1 to a few full members of the House of Reveries, and if your performance is good enough, one of them will sponsor you. And if you get a sponsor, you are allowed to progress to the second stage of the auditions, in which you get provided a mask and your first status in the house. You're not a member yet, but you will be called a hopeful from that point on, as you are hoping to join the House of Reveries as a permanent member. As a hopeful, you can enter the facilities at Valentil, prime of which is the Manor of Masks, the house used by the House of Reveries to practice their craft in privacy. Here you're allowed to train with professionals for your second edition, as you're being guided by a mentor, which is a senior member of the house tasked to guide the hopefuls. After honing their skills, the hopefuls go up for a second audition, this time in front of the Grand Maestro of the troupe, which at the time of the Elder Scrolls Online, when we encounter the House of Reveries, is a guy named Grand Maestro Forte, who will decide whether or not you will be allowed to join the troupe as a full member, or whether you will need to try again next season. As I said before, we can encounter this troupe in the Elder Scrolls Online, where we can infiltrate the group as we undertake a mission to look for someone's sibling in the Manor of Masks West. This quest, in my opinion, is quite good, and I'm very hesitant to spoil it, as it's not really full of extra lore that I haven't told yet, but the quest itself is full of twists and turns and careful investigation as you try to find out which of the mask-wearing individuals is the lost sibling, so you can convince that sibling to come back to their family or stay at the House of Reveries. This quest has a pretty amazing plot twist and covers some of the more interesting world lore that I plan to cover in a future video. However, covering that now would be spoiling the quest, and since that lore is unrelated to the House of Reveries, I will not spoil it now, so you can play the quest if you wish and have all the plot twists intact. You can get the quest by talking to this lady in Valentil. Again, the plot twists, I didn't see them coming, and that's pretty rare. I really recommend playing the quest if you want. Mind was blown, let's just say that. Alright, and that's about all I can say about the House of Reveries. Now, next up and last for this video, let's talk about some minor factions. Specifically, let's talk about some of the minor and obscure guilds that we see around Tamriel that you may not have heard of. I mean, while everyone has heard of guilds like the Mages Guild, the Thieves Guild and the Fighters Guild, there are many more smaller guilds around the continent. Like I said in the beginning, we even have a Ratcatchers Guild. So let's talk about these more obscure little guilds. So, obscure guilds. Something you need to know is that most of the Tamriel-wide guilds, or at least Empire-wide guilds, got their start back in the Second Era with the signing of the so-called Guild Act, which famously brought the Mages Guild and Fighters Guild to life. The Guild Act was primarily meant to give the Fighters Guild an official role in the Tamrielic Empire as dependable mercenaries who could be hired to protect local cities and kingdoms. You see, back in the Second Era, under the rule of the first Akaviri Potentate, there were a lot of rebellions in the Empire, and the Potentate spent years campaigning with the Imperial legions to quell those rebellions. Now, during the height of all those rebellions, the Potentate instituted a new law which disbanded all local armies, with only city and town garrisons seemingly exempt from this law. Of course, this caused for a lot of unrest and even more rebellions, as local lords of the Empire refused to give up their standing armies. This led to a 37-year-long civil war within the Empire, in which the Akaviri Potentate used the Imperial legions to completely crush all local armies until the Imperial Legion, so the army of the Central Imperial Government, was the only serious fighting force left within the Empire's borders. However, this ultimate victory came at a big cost, as the bloody civil war had left Tamriel ravaged, and the lack of local standing armies gave bandits virtually free reign over much of the Empire's outer provinces, and the Imperial Legion was already spread too thinly to really deal with them. This is when the Guild Act was passed, a new law which sanctioned guilds in the Empire of certain professions that had to pay a certain percentage of their profits to the Imperial government in exchange for official Imperial recognition. The main objective of this law was the creation of the Fighters Guild as dependent Empire-wide mercenaries that the local lords could hire to deal with the bandits roaming around their land instead of having a standing army. But an unforeseen consequence of this act was the creation of many more guilds around Tamriel, which followed a similar model to the newly created Fighters Guild. While the Mages Guild is the biggest and most well-known example of this, we have many more. For example, there is the Merchants Guild, which loosely unites the merchants and shopkeepers of local towns, enforcing rules upon them such as universal opening times of their shops, and most likely also the prevention of pricing wars between competing merchants in the towns where the guild is active. You also have several guilds pertaining to the entertainment sectors of the Empire, such as the Actors Guild, which unites the actors of regions and which itself produces plays and seems to educate aspiring actors. The guild also recommends and reviews non-guild plays and performances for the public, and will even warn the public about really bad plays, although I can also see a bit of protectionism in that, as the guild might just negatively review almost anything made outside of the guild, but we don't have much evidence for that. Now, other than that, in the entertainment sector, you've also got the Minstrels Guild that we practically know nothing about, other than that it employs minstrels. And another very interesting guild that we know of is the Scenarists Guild, which interestingly is one of the few guilds that has operated around Tamriel since before the Guild Act. The Scenarists Guild has their own headquarters in an ancient citadel on the border between Hammerfell and Skyrim, and they mostly employ writers and historians, with a lot of cities having an outpost of the guild. The members of the Scenarists Guild in a city outpost are known to do research and write history volumes on the local area, but also offer their services to the local population and even to tourists, providing historical tours and lectures about the city that they reside in or the region that they reside in, when people want to learn about local history. Funnily enough, they also keep themselves busy by trying to solve riddles and puzzles.
which is very cool, I guess. Now, kind of similar to them is the Scribes Guild, of whom we know next to nothing. However, if I had to guess, the Scribes Guild most likely unites local scribes that do administration, while the Scenaris Guild seems to be more like a historian's guild, if that makes sense. Now, next up we have a lot more traditional service professions that have their own guild. So you've got a cook's guild, a brewer's guild, a cobbler's guild, a labourer's guild, a tailor's guild, a weaver's guild, a vintner's guild, an astrologer's guild, a barrister's guild, a caravanier's guild, a mason's guild, and a tinker's guild. Of many of those we know quite little. In fact, of the Cook's Guild we only know that they employ local cooks. Of the Cobbler's Guild we only know that they employ shoemakers. Of the Brewer's Guild we only know that they employ brewers. Of the Tailor's Guild we only know that they employ those who make clothes. The Vintner's Guild employs those who make wine. The Astrologer's Guild employs astrologers. The Barrister's Guild employs lawyers and other illegal experts. The Caravanier's Guild employs trading caravan owners and workers. The Masons Guild employs masons and other builders, and the Tinkers Guild employs those who work with tin. That's really all we know about them. The only one of those artisan guilds that we know a little bit more about is the Weavers Guild, and then specifically we know only about them that other than employing fabric makers, they were well known for producing the best quality fabrics around the continent, and that in some regions they had a near monopoly on the trade of fabrics. That's all. Now, next to those mentioned guilds, we also have a Rat Catcher's Guild. Pretty funny that you need a guild for that. And a Furrier's Guild. Not a furry guild, but a Furrier's Guild, which are fur merchants and those who can work with fur and are able to expertly clean fur clothing. Cool. Now, while everyone knows about the Mages Guild, we know that there were some very specific other magical guilds on Tamriel, which mostly provided a very specific magical service as opposed to the Mages Guild, which had a more broad mandate about magic. For example, you had the Healers Guild, which specifically employed healing mages, and we know that there were specific smaller guilds for alchemy, but we don't know anything about those unfortunately. Now, a guild we do know a bit more about is the so-called Bailiffs Guild, a guild which educated and united the bailiffs of the Empire. By the way, a bailiff, for those who don't know, were usually local officials that can have a various range of responsibilities in towns and cities, usually acting as a proxy for the local lord in administration and justice matters for the people of the town or the city. And I presume that through this guild one could likely become educated to become a bailiff and then keep in contact with others of the profession across many of the towns and cities of Tamriel. Now, some ex-members of this city actually appeared in the Elder Scrolls Online's Thieves Guild DLC, meaning that actually Bethesda has not forgotten about all these obscure guilds. But other than that, we know, again, very little about this one. Now, a guild that we actually know a bit more of is the Prostitutes Guild, which I actually already talked about in my wider video on prostitution on Tamriel, which is in the description in case you want to know about it. Not a meme video, serious video. So check that out if you want to know more. Now, of the Prostitutes Guild, we know that it hires and protects the local sex workers of the different cities. Each chapter is led by a so-called guild mistress, and the guild does not just provide sexual services, but also apparently puts on large-scale dance and art shows and parades on large holidays, or at least in some of the bigger cities where they're active. Now, the final obscure guild that I want to talk about in this video is the Architects Guild. They employ architects across the Empire and apparently are somewhat uniformizing the building standards across the Empire. We also know that this guild is one of the bigger and better organized ones and is able to withstand large-scale civil wars with the parties at war, both trusting the guild to do work for them. Or perhaps they just have very little choice, as nearly every Tamrielic architect is apparently part of the guild. And that is about all I can say about Tamriel's obscure guilds. Now, I sincerely hope that you enjoyed that piece of lore and that you enjoyed every little piece of lore in this big long-form lore collection. And if you learned something new, great. Maybe give the video a like or like one of those hype boosts or whatever YouTube calls it nowadays. Oh, and if you're still here after like 1.5 hours, why not tell me in the comments what your favorite sport is? I usually do this with these long form lore collections and it usually confuses people, like why are people talking about this random thing? So you know, let's confuse people again and let's talk about your favorite sport if you're still here. I will know what you're talking about, other people won't. Mine is Formula 1, by the way. I really like the science of the aerodynamics of those cars. I'm a physics teacher and a nerd, I'm sorry. Anyway, see you later.